What's going on, everybody? It's Coach Matt Ellis over here at EliteThrowsCoaching.com, and today we're going to be wrapping up the part of this conjugate video series that goes over the Critique of Westside video that was done by Chad Wesley Smith and Dr. Mike Israetel underneath their Juggernaut Training Systems YouTube channel. The last three scientific principles that we go over are the scientific principles of variation, phase potentiation, and individual differences. All right, so let's talk about the first principle, which is the principle of variation. Now, according to Chad and Dr. Mike, these are the goods and the bads of variation as it relates to a raw powerlifter. The reason why we're talking about powerlifting in these videos is because what we should be doing as track and field coaches, as throws coaches, and with our athletes in the weight room is we need to have testers. We need to have exercises that we can give our athletes to test to see if they are getting stronger. Our testers in the weight room might be something like a squat, a bench press, and a deadlift. Maybe it's a hex bar deadlift. Maybe it's a touch and go bench press. Maybe it's a walked out squat, squatting below parallel or squatting down to a box and standing up again. Whatever it might be, whatever you feel comfortable having your athletes test, that's what we're trying to improve. That way we know that they are getting stronger. And what this really has to do with is the general strength in the weight room, making sure that we are getting generally stronger so that we know that general strength is going to transfer into the specific strength that we build as the season moves on. So you need to choose testers. Now, the good part about variation is that there's really no staleness, there's no boredom. It's different exercises all the time, different exercises all the week, new exercises, new movements. It's not the same thing every week. It's not something like 5x5 where you're going, all right, what are we doing this week? Well, we're doing a 5x5 squat, 5x5 bench. Okay, or it's not triples every week. Or what are you doing today? Low bar triples. What are you doing next week? Low bar triples. What are you doing next week? Low bar triples. I know some coaches who literally do the same workout twice a week all season long. So it's going to be sort of this combo upper body, lower body day, and then later on in the week, the same exact workout just all over again, and they do that for a 12 to 13 week season. That doesn't make sense. You need to have some variation. You need to have some, variety. You need to change the angles. Go from a flat bench to an incline bench. Go from a wide stance squat to a narrow stance squat. Maybe change the lifts around. Straight bar deadlift to a hex bar deadlift. Barbell clean to a dumbbell clean. You can change the bars, like a safety squat bar or a football bar, a Swiss bar, where instead of benching with the hands here, the hands are more on up and down position. Changing it up keeps it interesting. Variety is a great thing, but there's also some bad that goes along with it. So the biggest thing about the bad is it's too much variation from your testing lift. You can't have it be too much variety. So if your testing lift is a touch and go bench press, and you have people do, say, an ultra wide bench press with your feet up on the bench with a 3-second pause on the chest using chains and bands, that's way too varied from what you're going to use. So too much variation, not enough specificity, that can be a bad thing. There's also too much of a learning curve, especially for your younger athletes. If you're constantly introducing new exercises to them, every single week is going to be something new. They're never going to know how to push or how much to push because it's always a brand new exercise and they're always learning. The other thing, it's just way too broad. Sometimes you have to keep it a little bit more specific, which is something that we already talked about. If there's too much variety, if the exercise selection is just way too broad, way too out of left field, it's not going to make sense. You want there to be variety so there's no boredom, but you don't want it to be so varied and so broad that the athletes have no idea and you as a coach has no idea if your athletes are actually getting stronger. All right, so it's pretty easy to take the bad parts of variation and make them good. It's very simple. All we're going to do essentially is if we have too much variation, we know that's not a good thing. We only want to be one variation away from the tester. So say, for example, let's take one I know we all do, which is bench press. If your tester is lift the bar down to the chest, touch and go, 1 rep max. If that's your tester, if that's how you're going to test your athletes to see if they're getting stronger, you only want to be 1 variation away from that. So 1 week, you go a close grip bench press, down and up. The next week, wide grip bench press, down and up. The next week, regular grip, where you would normally grip the bar if you were going to hit a new 1 rep max, but maybe it's a 1 or 2 second pause on the chest. The next week, maybe it's just like you're going to do in a competition bench press, but instead it's touch and go, just like you're going to do when you're testing, but the feet are up on the bench. So 1 variation away. If your tester is a squat, just a regular athletic stance box squat, maybe 1 week you go wide, maybe 1 week you go down to a box, maybe 1 week you use a different bar like a safety squat bar or a cambered bar. You can do that in bench press as well. Deadlift, if you have your athletes do a lot of deadlifts, maybe 1 week you pull a regular deadlift like you're going to do as your tester. The next week you do a hex bar deadlift. The next week maybe you put the weights up on blocks, so it's a 2-inch or a 3-inch block to work the top part of the deadlift. You only want 1 variation. If you go crazy with 5 different things, it's not going to transfer over to that tester. So again, it's going to have a minimized learning curve because you're just changing 1 thing, and we're not going as broad as a lot of other programs say to do. We're keeping it very similar to that tester. Next up, it's my favorite one to say, phase potentiation. We're going to explain that to you. And again, just like this, very easy way to fix it. You don't even really have to do anything because as you'll find out, our season kind of takes care of that on its own. All right, so let's move on to talk about phase potentiation. Again, my favorite one of the whole thing to say, phase potentiation. Well, basically, Chad Wesley Smith, Dr. Mike, what they are saying is that when you look at the Westside method, the Westside conjugate method that was written about in the mid to late 2000s, there are no phases. Okay, now when you take a look at what the guys at Westside are doing, especially with social media, you can tell that there is a more phasic structure to what they're doing, but for the most part, when it was written about, back in mid 2000s, late 2000s, there was no phasic structure. So there really isn't any good behind that, because when we are doing our training, when we are working with athletes, when we are working with lifters, you need to have phases of training. Essentially, you need to have an off season, a preseason, and an in season. So normally it's going to be hypertrophy, which is putting in muscular strength, general strength, and a peaking phase. Now, the bad part about the Westside method is that none of these things existed. It was pretty much a permanent peaking program. One of the things that Louie Simmons would always say and write about is that his athletes are always ready to compete. His athletes are always lifting at or above 90%. His athletes could take a really short taper and PR and compete in a meet. We know as track coaches when our meets are going to be. For example, here in Rhode Island, we have the summer, which is our off season. We have the fall, which is our preseason. We then have indoor track, which happens during the winter. It's a 13-week season, typically. And then spring is another 13-week for outdoor track. So our phases are already there. We have an off season, we have a preseason, we have in season. So the way that the school year is broken up and the way that our seasons are broken up really take care of this for us. So we don't really have to worry too much about this, but what I am going to explain to you is the way to do it so that you can break up your team throughout the year to make sure that you have the correct phases at the correct times. All right, so as I already talked about, this is kind of easy. Obviously, the off season, the summertime, this is going to be your hypertrophy phase. It still can be a conjugate system, but what we're going to do is we're going to play with the amount of sets and the amount of reps and what you're doing for your accessory movements. Again, sets and reps, how many exercises, and your frequency, how many days a week you're going in the gym. It still can be a conjugate method, but it's just going to be based on getting the athletes bigger and more muscular. Okay? During the fall, this is when we are working on our general strength. This is our preseason. So again, we're going to take a little bit step away from that hypertrophy, which is normally lighter weights, higher repetitions. We're going to increase the weight a little bit more and work on lowering the repetitions a little bit. There's still going to be some hypertrophy work in there. It's all going to blend together. We're going to show you how to do that. But the general strength happens during the fall. And obviously, winter and spring, if we do a winter indoor track and field season and a spring outdoor track and field season, this is going to be our peaking phase. This is going to be our competitive seasons. Now, the other thing we need to talk about, and we'll take care of this in a future video, I promise, is what's going to happen during that peaking phase. Obviously, if you have a 13-week season, you don't want your athletes to peak at the beginning of that season. You don't want your athlete to throw his furthest throw or to throw as far or jump as far as possible that first little introductory dual meet that happens. You want them throwing and jumping and sprinting as fast and as far as they can at the end of the season for championship meets. So again, we're going to have phases and we're going to have structures that are going to be able to get our athletes on a yearly plan to get better. So imagine if an athlete who's a freshman starts out hypertrophy the summer before their freshman year, general strength in the fall, and then peaking during the winter and spring. And then they do that again as a sophomore. Get a little bit bigger, get a little bit stronger, get a little bit faster. Then they do it as a junior, bigger, stronger, faster. And then a senior. Imagine what's going to happen. You're going to have 16 seasons, not just 2 or 3, 16 seasons to get your athletes. So we got to make sure we do this right. The phasic structure is already there, so we don't really have to worry about it too much. The season and us planning for our athletes ahead of time will take care of it on its own. All right, we are going to wrap up this video today by talking about the last scientific principle, which is individual differences. Now, the great part about individual differences is that we have teams of, whatever it might be, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 athletes between all of our throwers and jumpers and sprinters and everybody else. Everybody is different. Everyone's a special snowflake. So everyone's a little different, but you can create exercises and kind of prescribe exercises for every issue. So your javelin thrower that's got a really hurt shoulder, he can use a safety bar squat. You're really kind of awkward, gangly kid that doesn't understand how to do a deadlift with a straight bar, he might be better using a hex bar. So there is an exercise for every issue, and variation of the individual differences allow you to work around injuries very, very well just by changing up angles, changing up the bar, changing up the amount of sets and repetitions, the amount of volume. You can kind of change all that stuff. Okay? The bad part about individual differences when you look at a program like the Westside method that was written about back in the mid-2000s, when you look at a typical conjugate training system, is that for smaller, newer female athletes, the SRA curve might not be enough. It might not be enough overload. You might not be in the gym as many days a week as you should be. You might not be squatting as many days per week as you should be, or doing as much upper body every week as you should be. Where you may have a brand new freshman female athlete who has never done any type of weight training before, who is a smaller thrower, for example. She might be able to do 2 days of squatting heavy every week, but a typical conjugate program and a typical Westside method that was written about back in the mid-2000s, you're not squatting heavy twice a week. So is it going to be enough? Maximum recoverable volume. It might not be enough work. It might not be enough volume. You may, doing something like a heavy single, if your max squat is only, say, 75 or 85 pounds, that might not be enough. You might be able to drop down to, say, 65 or 70 pounds and do that for 3 to 5 repetitions. So working up to a heavy single might not always be a good thing. You might need to do more volume. You might need to be in the weight room more days per week, but you're probably already thinking to yourself, well, Coach Matt, there's no way we can get in the weight room 4 days a week. There's no way we can get in the weight room 5 days a week. That's not how this works. We have practice, we have track meets. We have some days where the freshman and JV team is at practice, but the varsity team is at a nighttime meet that happens during the week. Sometimes we can get in the weight rooms on Fridays. Sometimes we can't. How is this going to work? How are we going to get in the weight room and have our kids squatting 2-3 days a week? Well, quick answer is, just like with the other two things, the season kind of takes care of it for you. You know, you have meets, you have practices. This is not the end-all be-all of what we do. We can't sacrifice time on the track or time in the throwing circles to be in the weight room. We're throwers, we need to throw. I say that all the time. So a lot of this we really can't do anything about during the season. During the fall and during the summer, you can do a lot. You can have them go in the weight room, 4 to 5, 6 times a week if you want them to, if you think they can handle it. But during the season, can't really do anything about it. So what we're going to do, just like we did before, we're going to talk about the bad. We're going to write down how we can adjust and arrange that throughout in green marker, how you can do that throughout the year and throughout your season possibly. But again, there's really not a whole heck of a lot that you can do to really avoid this, because there's only so much time that we have our athletes. There's only so much that we can get done during a season. So this, again, does not really apply, but we are going to explain how to make it good. Okay, so how do we take this bad and make it good? Well, that gets a big question mark from me, because it all depends on your season, how long your season might be, how often you're able to see your athletes. That's all really going to depend on you. I still think 2 days a week in the weight room is perfect, so we just have to make sure that we are pushing our athletes, especially our smaller, newer female athletes, that we're pushing them harder, giving them more volume, because they can recover from it a lot easier. But some other ways you might be able to do it: if, for example, you have your beginner athletes and your newer, younger athletes, they might not be competing at the end of the season. They may not qualify for those big championship meets, those big invites that you have to qualify for. They might not throw far enough, they might not jump far enough, they might not run fast enough. So they may have 3 to 4 weeks at the end of the season where they're not competing. So that's when you could throw in an extra day or two in the weight room to really have them do a little bit of extra work. The other thing is, during the summer and the fall, you can certainly assign an extra upper body day or an extra lower body day and make sure that your athletes are getting in the extra work during the summer and the fall. But to be quite honest with you, during the season, where you might only be able to get in the weight room twice a week, you're really not going to be able to prescribe or assign extra workouts for your beginner, younger, smaller female athletes. But you just got to make sure you're pushing them hard. As long as you're pushing them hard, prescribing extra volume, everybody else is doing a set of 6, they're doing sets of 8, everyone else is doing 3 sets of 10, they're doing 4 sets of 10. Give them the extra work. It's not going to take that much longer in the weight room, but prescribe extra work for them that they can do when you're in the weight room, to make sure you're giving them extra volume, to make sure you're giving them enough work. Okay, so that wraps up this part of our conjugate video series that talks about the Critique of Westside video done by Chad Wesley Smith and Dr. Mike Israetel. If you want to learn more about that, you can certainly go to the Juggernaut Training Systems website and do a search. It's just called Critique of Westside. It's a very good video that explains a lot of the background behind this. But what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to go through, we're going to take everything that we've put in green throughout the past 3 videos, and we're going to write it down on the board. And that's going to be the structure, the spine, the backbone, whatever you want to call it, to create a good conjugate system. We're going to take what makes a conjugate system, and we're going to include all of those ingredients, all of the good stuff that you've been learning about these past couple of videos. We're going to put that into play to make sure to give you a proper structure when you start to implement the conjugate system with your athletes. Thanks again so much for checking out the video. Make sure to go to elitethrowscoaching.com to read the blog post that goes along with this, and I'll see you guys all next week.